Hey, it's Mr. Shrum, and I'm back again with the biology tutorial walkthroughs. And today we're going to look at the nervous system. After this lesson, we'll develop and use a model to show how the nervous system processes and responds to stimuli from all other body systems. So let's get into that. Here's the tutorial. Here's the warm-up question. Sensory organs respond to stimuli from the environment. Stimuli is any activity from your environment. Can you name a sensory organ and then briefly, very briefly explain what it does? So a sample answer is the eye or eyes. They're sensory organs because sight is one of our major senses. Eyes can process light, allowing us to differentiate. We can tell different colors from each other and shapes to create an image of the surrounding environment. Another warm-up question. Oh, well, it shows the answer already. Which reaction is an example of a reflex? Have you ever heard of the term reflex? I think most people have. It's something your body does that you don't really think about, but it just happens. And it's usually when you touch something hot or really cold, your body will react. And people need to act quickly without taking time to think. These are reflex actions. So quickly pulling your hand away from something that could hurt you is a perfect example of that. And the first thing we're going to talk about is a neuron or neurons. So if the body were a computer, imagine your body is a computer, your nervous system would be the processor, the central processor. It sends signals to your organs when it's time for your body to do something. So hunger signals are sent from the nervous system to the stomach, and that tells you when it's time to eat. It makes you hungry. It tells your legs to run at the start of a race, and also makes us jump when something spooks us or startles us. All of these reactions are possible because of neurons. These little guys are the building blocks of the nervous system. They're specialized cells that process and transmit nerve signals. Most human body cells have the ability to reproduce. New cells replace old cells that eventually die off. Neurons are different in this way. They stop reproducing soon after birth. So most of the neurons we're born with will be with us throughout our entire life. But in some organisms like fish, reptiles, and amphibians, neurons reproduce just like other cells in the body. A neuron has a cell body similar to all other cells in our human bodies. But because transmitting signals is its primary function, it has specialized structures that set it apart from other types of cells. And we're going to look at what is inside a neuron. And there are three basic parts. We have the dendrites. These are these little branch-looking things. The dendrites gather signals from other neurons and then convert them into electrical signals called impulses. Then they transmit these impulses to the cell body. The cell body is also known as soma. It contains the nucleus and the cell organelles. So this looks a lot like our typical cell, and it just has these branches called dendrites sticking out of it. And then we have an axon. Axons are large fibers that extend from the cell body. Each neuron has exactly one axon, and axons are generally long. They're covered in a myelin sheath, and this sheath acts as insulation, and it helps the axon transmit impulses very quickly. Axons carry nerve impulses to other neurons through junctions called synapses. They can transmit nerve impulses to other types of cells, such as muscle cells. So dendrites take in signals from other neurons, converts them into electrical impulses, and they're sent to the cell body. And then that goes to the axon, and they are able to carry those impulses to other neurons through synapses, and they can also go to other types of cells. There are three classifications of neurons. We have sensory neurons. They carry impulses from the external environment to our central nervous system, or CNS. And the CNS is comprised of the brain and our spinal cord. And that spinal cord is a bundle of nerve fibers enclosed by the vertebral column. So feel your spine along your back at the spinal cord, and that's where a lot of nerves are stored. Sensory neurons are in your skin, your muscles, and organs. They can indicate temperature as well as pain. For example, when someone touches a hot object, the receptors in the skin are stimulated. The sensory neurons in the fingertips convert the stimulus into an impulse, and they carry those impulses to the central nervous system. You can see that here. Here's a hot object, receptor, sensory nerve fiber, interneurons, and the spinal cord. Interneurons are located in the spinal cord themselves and the brain. They act as connections between sensory neurons and motor neurons. And for example, when we touch a hot object, the impulse from the sensory neurons and the fingertips will travel to the motor neurons through the interneurons. So if you're picking up on the pattern, sensory neurons sense something, they carry those impulses connected with the interneurons, and then they go to the motor neurons. And the motor neurons carry impulses from the CNS to an effector organ. And an effector organ can be a muscle or gland, and that results in movement. So when we touch hot objects, the motor neurons transmit an impulse to the hand muscles as the effector that has an effect on something. This transmission makes us instantly pull our hand away. The brain processes most signals in the body, but in certain situations, the body needs to react immediately, very quickly. And responses that don't require the brain's participation are called spinal reflexes. These reflexes are triggered by a nerve pathway called the reflex arc, and that loops through the spinal cord. The arc involves sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. So we get the full picture here. Your receptor, sensory neurons, to the interneurons, to the motor neurons, and then the response. So let's discuss reflexes. There are two types of reflexes based on the reflex center. Spinal reflexes, those are actions centered on or looping through the spinal cord. The brain isn't part of that reflex process. Then we have brain reflexes, and those center on the brain stem, also called the medulla oblongata. Bonus points if you know a specific movie that mentions this. But it's a part of the brain stem responsible for vital functions, including control of the heart and the lungs. Brain reflexes are things like coughing, gagging, and blinking. For example, when we touch hot objects, the reflex arc generates a response that causes us to immediately move our hand away. That reaction happens quickly before the signal reaches the brain. We feel the pain sensation from the burn only when the signal reaches the brain. So here we'll test your understanding so far. A girl sitting on a park bench hears a car honk their horn. The noise startles her, causing her to jump. When she looks up, she sees her friend driving a car. She smiles and waves at her friend. Which statement is correct? Being startled is a reflexive action. Waving to a friend is voluntary. Yeah, being startled is a quick response, and it didn't require her to think about it. She just did it. So now we have a simulation from PhET. And we hide this meeting control. So you're given directions. Click stimulate neuron to start the simulation. To zoom in and out of those, use the plus or minus slider. Adjust the speed. So we'll go ahead and stimulate this neuron, and we'll see what the sodium ions, the potassium ions do. So we just stimulated the neuron. Oh, it looks like sodium ions they were entering the cell, and potassium ions were leaving the cell. Let's do that again. Just stimulated it. Looks like there are more sodium inside and more potassium outside of the neuron when that happens. Bam. I zoomed in a little bit. So it's letting in sodium and it's letting out potassium. So what's going on there? So sodium ions flood into the cytoplasm of the cell from the outside, and that increases the concentration of sodium ions inside the cell. So there's more sodium inside, and then potassium ions are moving outside. So there's less concentration of potassium ions in the cell. The cytoplasm of a neuron contains many negatively charged proteins, and that gives the cell a slightly negative charge at rest. What do you think happens to this charge when the neuron is stimulated? So when it's stimulated, there is an influx of sodium ions, and those ions are positive. So the cell acquires a positive charge. But when the positively charged potassium ions move outside of the cell, it returns to the previous state. So it's excited, but then it goes back to the previous state. Is your prediction supported by the membrane potential chart? Yes, it is. The chart shows that the initial charge of the neuron is negative. When the neuron is stimulated, sodium ions enter the cell, so the voltage inside the cell changes to positive, and then when the potassium ions move outward, the voltage decreases and it goes back to negative. A nerve impulse is an electrical charge running across a neuron. Explain why the simulation supports this explanation. Stimulation of a neuron causes a change in the charge inside the cell from negative to positive. This change is caused by ions. And ions are atoms with an electrical charge moving across the cell. This change within the cell is consistent with the definition of an electric charge. So we're going to look at nerve impulses a little more in depth now. A nerve impulse is an electric charge moving across neurons. Whenever a receptor of a sensory organ receives a stimulus from the outside, it's converted into an impulse. But when a neuron is not transmitting a signal, it's at rest, right? So here's a neuron at rest. Here's when sodium gates are open, potassium gates are open, return to rest. So first, neuron at rest. If it's at rest, the neuron membrane is polarized. The charge inside the cell is negative, and the charge outside the cell is positive. The difference in the positive and negative charge gives the neuron its resting potential. More sodium ions lie outside the cell than inside, while the reverse is true for potassium ions. And the reason is that proteins called the sodium-potassium pump actively transport sodium outside the cell and move potassium into the cytoplasm. For every 3 sodium ions pumped out, only 2 potassium ions are allowed in. This pumping makes the cell more negative on the inside than on the outside. But that's when it's at rest. So if it's if there's an impulse, a nerve impulse is called an action potential. Not all stimuli will result in an impulse, but to initiate an impulse, a stimulus needs to be at a certain minimum level called the threshold. When a stimulus reaches the threshold, it causes the sodium channels to open up first. As a result, sodium ions move into the cytoplasm, making the inside of the cell positively charged. Then the potassium gates open and potassium ions rush out of the cell. This process brings the cell back to its original charge. The speed at which a nerve impulse is transmitted varies. Remember that many axons have a layer of fatty substances wrapped around them. These substances form the myelin sheath. The sheath restricts the movement of sodium and potassium ions, but there are gaps in the myelinated axons that aren't insulated. And those gaps are called nodes of Ranvier. So the action potential travels or jumps from node to node, increasing the speed of transmission. So as a result, myelinated neurons generally carry impulses that are triggered from very sharp pain. Neurons that are not insulated, the unmyelinated axons, carry impulses triggered by dull, mild pain. So if there are sheaths, myelinated sheaths, those are for sharper pain. Unmyelinated axons are for less pain. So here we have a question. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a disease that affects the nerve cells of the brain and the spinal cord. Some of the symptoms of MS are chronic pain and pins and needles sensations, muscle weakness, and visual disturbances. Study the image and then explain the cause for these symptoms. Well, it looks like there's a damaged myelin sheath and exposed fibers here. Oops. So according to this image, the myelin sheath with MS, in a person with MS, it wears away. And if that's damaged, that affects the ability of the nerve cell to transmit impulses quickly. So it slows things down. And that can result in visual disturbances. It can also cause chronic dull pain. So we're going to go through synapses, and then I'll stop there for today, and then we'll pick up next time. So synapses. So how does a neuron exactly pass electrical signals to another neuron? It does so with the help of a junction called a synapse. And a synapse is a small gap that separates two neurons. And this allows a signal to flow from one neuron to another. So here's a synapse and three parts. You have a presynaptic cell, and that's an end that has neurotransmitters. You have a synaptic cleft that separates the two neurons. And then you have a postsynaptic end that has receptor sites for neurotransmitters. So let's look. When an action potential, also known as an impulse, reaches a neuron, the following events take place. The calcium channels at the end of the presynaptic neuron opens up. So at the presynaptic neuron, calcium ions are entering the cell. Calcium, you see how they're coming into the cell. Those calcium ions cause the vesicles to, the calcium ions are causing these vesicles that contain neurotransmitters to fuse with the cell membrane and release neurotransmitters by exocytosis. So this vesicle full of neurotransmitters, it's going to come over here to this cell, and neurotransmitters cross the synapse and bind to the receptors of the postsynaptic neurons. So they're expelled here from this cell, and then they go to specific channels. This action causes specific channels to open. So this image shows open sodium channels allowing sodium to enter the cell. The sodium ions inside the cell cause an action potential to occur. So the nerve transmission continues to travel through the body. And next time we're going to talk about parts of the nervous system. So I hope you enjoyed this so far, and we'll get into it next time. So until then, have a great day, a great week, and ask me any questions if you have any so far. But see you guys next time.